The year is 1862, and the chemist's shop on the high street smells of licorice and cloves and something underneath that you cannot name. Something earthy and faintly sweet, like rain on warm stone, like the inside of a wooden chest that has been kept closed for a long time. A woman stands at the counter. She's 34 years old. She's wearing black because she's been wearing black for 8 months, since her second child died in January of a fever that lasted 4 days and left no warning. The chemist does not ask her why she looks the way she looks. He has seen this expression before. He sees it often, on women of a certain age, in a certain year of grief. He's a practical man. He does not ask questions that would embarrass either of them. He reaches beneath the counter and produces a small brown bottle. The label reads, Laudanum, tincture of opium. 1 drachm contains 1 grain of opium. He wraps it in a square of brown paper and tells her 2 shillings. She pays without counting. She already has the bottle she came for from last month. She already knows what it does. But she's not told the chemist this, and he is not asked, and the transaction proceeds with the kind of comfortable imprecision that characterized a great deal of Victorian medical commerce. On the walk home, the bottle sits in her coat pocket. She can feel it through the wool. The street is ordinary, a coal merchant's cart. 2 women with market baskets talking on a corner, a boy running with a message, the sound of hammering from a workshop above a joiner's yard. The city produces its ordinary noise. She moves through it quietly. By the time she reaches her door, the coal fire has been burning for an hour and the parlour is warm. She sets the bottle on the mantelpiece. She does not open it immediately. She simply looks at it for a while, the way you look at something you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. The label faces outward. The brown glass is dark enough that you cannot see how much is left. Outside it is November. The street is ordinary. The city is going about its afternoon. And the story of how this bottle came to be on this mantelpiece, in this parlour, in this city, in this century, is a story that began 300 years earlier and is still, in various forms, continuing. A world of useful fictions. To understand laudanum, you must first understand the world it entered, a world in which pain was considered both inevitable and character-forming, in which the line between medicine and poison was drawn by intention rather than chemistry, and in which the bodies of women were regarded by the medical establishment as essentially ungovernable, prone to mysterious collapse, requiring management from without rather than understanding from within. You live, in this world, without aspirin, without paracetamol, without antibiotics, without reliable anesthesia, without the concept of the germ, without much that we would recognize as pharmacology in the modern sense. What you have is bark and root and leaf and resin. What you have is tradition. Centuries of accumulated domestic knowledge about which plants did what, passed between women in the way that domestic knowledge always travelled, informally and without documentation. And what you have is the confidence of men who write books about other men's books and call it medicine. Pain was everywhere in the Victorian era, not because Victorians were more fragile than we are, but because the ordinary machinery of life, childbirth, toothache, lung inflammation, intestinal disorder, the monthly cycle, arrived without the pharmaceutical buffer that a later century would take as given. The headache that a modern person treats with 2 tablets and a glass of water was, in 1850, simply a headache. It lasted until it chose to stop. The toothache was extracted when it became intolerable and not before. An extraction was a procedure performed without anaesthetic on a body held down by a dentist's assistant. The aftermath of childbirth was managed at home by whoever was available with whatever remedies the household kept. Into this world came laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, usually brandy or wine, sometimes flavoured with saffron or cinnamon or anise. The name itself derives, probably, from the Latin laudere, to praise, though this etymology has been disputed by philologists who prefer an Arabic root, and the question has never been entirely settled. What is not disputed is that the substance worked. In a pharmacological sense, it worked better than almost anything else available. It quieted pain, it slowed anxiety, it softened grief, it stopped coughs, calmed the gastrointestinal spasms that accompanied the dysentery and cholera of the period, and, in the doses routinely prescribed to infants, produced a sleep so deep it was sometimes mistaken for death. The opium from which laudanum was made came primarily from Turkey and India, shipped through London and Liverpool, traded openly at prices that fluctuated with the harvest. In the 1840s, a bottle of laudanum cost roughly a penny to 2p at the counter, less than a pint of ale, less than a loaf of bread in a lean year. It was available to everyone who could afford almost nothing. This was not a luxury medicine, in the way that the physician's consultation was a luxury. It was the medicine of the poor as much as the medicine of the drawing room, used in different concentrations and for somewhat different purposes, but drawn from the same bottles. Chemists stocked it. Grocers stocked it in some regions. Market stalls sold it in unlabelled bottles alongside vinegar and treacle. It appeared in domestic manuals of the 1830s and 1840s as a household staple, recommended for everything from cholera to teething pains to what the manuals called, with remarkable consistency, female complaint. The word complaint covered a great deal of ground. It was a category broad enough to contain grief, boredom, chronic pain, disappointment, and the ordinary misery of an ordinary life that offered, for most women, very few sanctioned outlets. The women who used laudanum most heavily were, by most available accounts, women of the middle and upper middle classes, women who had access to a physician, who could afford a regular prescription, who lived in houses with enough privacy to maintain a dependency without immediate social consequence. Working-class women used it too, but in different patterns, more likely to give it to their children as a management tool, more likely to buy it informally from neighbourhood suppliers, less likely to develop the long-term personal relationship with the bottle that middle-class memoirs and diaries describe. Class structured the relationship with the drug, as class structured everything in Victorian England. This is a history of that relationship across its full span, from the alchemist's laboratory in 16th century Switzerland to the chemist's counter in Victorian England to the parliamentary hearings that would, eventually, begin to restrict what had been freely sold for 300 years. It is a history of medicine and commerce, and gender and grief. It is also a history of what happens when a society decides that certain kinds of suffering, specifically the suffering of women, are best managed by quieting the person rather than changing the conditions that produced her pain. The bottle on the mantelpiece is the beginning, but the story starts much earlier than 1862, in a laboratory in a Swiss village where a difficult man with a grand name was trying to make something that worked. He made it. It worked. And what followed from that working took 3 centuries to fully reckon with. The alchemist's gift. The man who gave laudanum its name was born in 1493 in a small Swiss village called Einsiedeln, in a house near a pilgrimage chapel, where the smell of incense was permanent and unremarkable. His name, given at birth, was Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. He renamed himself in the fashion of Renaissance scholars who wanted the world to understand their ambitions. Something more impressive, Paracelsus. The name meant, roughly, beyond Celsus, beyond the Roman physician whose authority had dominated European medicine for 1,000 years. He meant it literally. He was not a man for false modesty. Paracelsus was a difficult man to be around by all contemporary accounts. He drank heavily and with a certain professional pride. He insulted his contemporaries with systematic thoroughness, and held the conviction, considered eccentric by the standards of his day, that medicine should be based on observation and experiment rather than the authority of ancient texts. He was, in many ways, centuries ahead of his time. He was also wrong about a great many things, and the combination of genuine insight and spectacular error makes him one of the stranger figures in the history of science. A man whose legacy is more useful than his methods. What concerns us here is a preparation he described sometime in the 1520s, which he called laudanum. His original formula varied across his writings. He was not a precise man, and he revised his ideas without always noting when he had done so. But most accounts suggest it involved opium dissolved in wine or alcohol, combined with other substances including, in some versions, gold leaf, pearls, and what he called the quintessence of coral. The golden pearls were alchemical additions, reflecting his sincere belief in the philosophical and medical properties of metals and minerals. The opium was the part that actually did anything in a pharmacological sense. Paracelsus wrote about this preparation with the enthusiasm of a man who has discovered fire in a room full of people who are still making do with flint. He called opium the stone of immortality. He claimed it could cure almost any ailment the body could produce. He used it on his own patients and reported results that, by contemporary standards, were genuinely impressive. not because of the gold or the pearls, but because opium, in any era, is effective at what it does. It suppresses pain through mechanisms we now understand in some detail. It slows the physiological responses that accompany suffering. It produces, in sufficient doses, a detachment from physical experience so complete that the suffering becomes temporarily abstract. The preparation Paracelsus described was not widely used in the 16th century. His reputation, brilliant, erratic, terminally self-aggrandizing, prone to burning the books of Avicenna in public as a rhetorical gesture, meant that his innovations were adopted slowly, filtered through the skepticism of contemporaries who had tired of his announcements. He died in 1541 in Salzburg, under circumstances that have never been entirely established. His laudanum recipe survived him in his manuscripts, circulating among physicians and apothecaries who were drawn to his empirical approach even when they found his personality insupportable. But it would be more than a century before anyone turned the recipe into something that chemists could produce reliably and sell with confidence. That transformation belongs to a man named Thomas Sydenham, an English physician born in Dorset in 1624, who could hardly have been more different from Paracelsus in temperament or manner. Where Paracelsus was theatrical and grandiose, Sydenham was methodical, quiet, and possessed of what his biographers describe as an almost compulsive insistence on clinical observation. He walked his patients home when they were too ill to walk alone. He sat with them through fevers. He kept notes that were distinguished, for the period, by their attention to the patient rather than to the disease category. Sydenham began developing his own version of the laudanum preparation in the 1660s. By 1676 he had settled on a formula he considered reliable: 2 ounces of strained opium, 1 ounce of saffron, a drachm each of cinnamon and cloves, all dissolved in a pint of Canary wine. The saffron gave it a golden colour that made it visually distinct from other preparations. The wine made it palatable enough that patients did not resist taking it. The opium made it work. He called it Sydenham's laudanum, and he used it extensively in his practice for pain, for the diarrhea of dysentery, for what he described as the passions of the mind, a category that encompassed what later medicine would call anxiety and depression. Sydenham's laudanum spread through English medical practice more rapidly than Paracelsus's preparation had done, for reasons that had as much to do with Sydenham's character as with the preparation's properties. He was trusted. He was careful. He was associated with a particular empirical rigour that the medical establishment of the late 17th century admired. When a physician with Sydenham's reputation described a preparation as reliable and useful, other physicians attended. And his formula was practical in ways that alchemical preparations often were not. It could be made in quantity from available ingredients, it kept well in glass, and it could be bottled and sold across a counter without requiring the expertise of a trained alchemist. By the end of the 17th century, laudanum was being manufactured commercially in London by apothecaries who had their own variants, different spices, different base wines, slightly different concentrations, but whose core formula was essentially Sydenham's. The recommended dose for adults was typically 10 to 20 drops in a small glass of water. What this meant in terms of actual opium content varied enormously from one manufacturer to another because there was no standardization of the raw material's potency and no mechanism for enforcing consistency in the final product. The inconsistency of concentration was, from the very beginning, one of laudanum's defining problems and one that its promoters tended to underemphasize. A bottle purchased in London in 1720 might contain twice the opiate content of an identically labelled bottle purchased in Bristol the same week. The difference between a therapeutic dose and an overdose was, in practice, partly a matter of luck and partly a matter of the customer's familiarity with a specific manufacturer's product. Regular customers learned over time how many drops of their preferred preparation produced relief without distress. New customers had no such calibration. The physician who prescribed did not always know what the apothecary was dispensing. What physicians and apothecaries knew about opium in the early 18th century was almost entirely empirical, gathered from observation of patients over years rather than from any understanding of mechanism. They knew it worked. They knew it could kill. They knew from observation that patients who used it regularly seemed to require more of it over time to achieve the same effect, a phenomenon they described as habituation, without understanding why it occurred. They knew that stopping abruptly after long use produced symptoms they described as extreme restlessness and violent nervousness. They did not know about opioid receptors. They did not know about tolerance at a neurochemical level. The early history of laudanum is, in this sense, the history of a powerful tool adopted before its mechanisms were understood. Paracelsus gave it a name and a framework of alchemical theory. Sydenham gave it a reproducible formula and a clinical context. The apothecaries of England gave it a price and a shelf position, and the patients, among them, disproportionately, women seeking management of the ordinary and extraordinary suffering that their bodies and lives produced, gave it a permanent place in the domestic pharmacopoeia of a nation that would spend the next 2 centuries working out what it had invited in. By the time the 18th century ended, laudanum had become a fixture of English domestic life in the way that fire is a fixture, something that warms and also burns, something so embedded in the ordinary that the question of whether it should be there is no longer asked. It appeared in household recipe books alongside instructions for pickling and preserving. It was mentioned in letters without comment or explanation, the way a later generation would mention aspirin. It was the remedy you reached for when other remedies had failed, and also, increasingly, the remedy you reached for before other remedies had been tried, because the other remedies were slower and more uncertain and more expensive, and the brown bottle was right there. Paracelsus is buried in the porch of St. Sebastian's Church in Salzburg. The inscription on his tomb in Latin calls him a physician, a surgeon, a researcher, a naturalist. It does not mention laudanum. It does not mention the long and complicated shadow his preparation would cast across the bodies and lives of women who were not yet born, in a century he could not have imagined. He would not have understood the phrase pharmaceutical industry, but he would have understood the impulse to take something that grew in a field, to process it through human ingenuity and chemical knowledge, and to sell it to people in pain. He understood that impulse very well. It was, in the most basic sense, what he was doing. The apothecaries who compounded Sydenham's formula in the 1680s and 1690s did not all produce it with the same care or the same raw materials. Opium varied in quality depending on its origin, its age, and the conditions under which it had been stored. Old opium, exposed to light and air, degraded in ways that altered its potency without changing its appearance. Fresh opium from a reliable Turkish source was considerably stronger than the same weight of opium that had been sitting in a warehouse since the previous shipping season. The apothecary who knew his supplier and tested his materials could produce a consistent preparation. The apothecary who bought whatever was cheapest at the wholesale market could not. The patient had no way of knowing which kind she had purchased until she had taken her dose. The range of potency in commercial laudanum across the 18th and early 19th centuries was one of the consistent complaints in the medical literature of the period, and one that several physicians attempted to address through advocacy for standardization without producing any lasting regulatory change. John Ayrton Paris, writing in his Pharmacology of 1820, one of the more systematically organized pharmaceutical reference works of the early 19th century, noted that the tincture of opium as sold by different chemists could vary in strength by a factor of several times, and that this variation made prescribing a somewhat uncertain enterprise, even for physicians who understood what they were doing. For the patient who was self-prescribing from the chemist's counter, the uncertainty was more acute and the consequences of misjudgment more direct. The story of laudanum's origins is, in this sense, a story about the transformation of a botanical fact into a commercial system. The opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, its Latin name carrying the promise of sleep in its syllables, had been cultivated in the Mediterranean and the Middle East for thousands of years. Its milk, harvested by scoring the unripe seed capsules and collecting the latex that oozed from the cuts, had been used in various forms since antiquity, in Egyptian medicine, in Greek and Roman practice, in the medical traditions of the Islamic world from which much of European medicine ultimately drew. What Paracelsus and Sydenham contributed was not the discovery of opium's properties but the development of a form, the alcohol tincture, the standardized formula, the commercially scalable preparation that could be manufactured, distributed, and sold through the networks of early modern European trade. The botanical fact was ancient. The commercial system was new. It was the commercial system that produced everything that followed. The remedy in every cabinet. By the early 18th century, laudanum had become so ordinary that its mention in household accounts requires no explanation and produces no special notation. It appears in the domestic records of English families the way candles appear, as a consumable, expected, replaced when it runs low, recorded without comment in the same columns as coal and soap. The housekeeper's book of a Suffolk estate from 1714 lists laudanum between oil of turpentine and conserve of roses at a cost of 4p the ounce. No diagnosis is attached, no physician is named, someone needed it, someone purchased it. The account moves on to the next item. This ordinariness is the thing most difficult to reconstruct from a distance of 3 centuries. We are accustomed to thinking of opiate use as exceptional, as a departure from ordinary life, as something that requires an explanation and a justification. In the 18th century it required no more explanation than a dose of fever bark or a poultice of mustard. The medicine chest of a prosperous household, and many households of middling means aspired to one as a sign of domestic prudence, would almost certainly contain it, alongside rhubarb, ipecacuanha, camphor, and one of the various patent preparations that promised to address almost everything. To lack laudanum in your medicine chest in 1730 was to be unprepared. The patent medicine trade was central to laudanum's spread through the culture. From the mid-17th century onward, London apothecaries and later commercial manufacturers produced proprietary preparations whose names were reassuring and whose formulas were secret, or at least unpublished, which amounted to the same thing from the customer's perspective. Daffy's elixir, first sold in the 1650s by the Reverend Thomas Daffy, contained senna, anise, and caraway, and was marketed as a general remedy. It was not originally an opiate preparation, but it was adulterated and varied over the following century in ways that made its contents unreliable. Goddard's drops, a volatile salt preparation favoured by Charles II, had a reputation for reviving the swooned that may or may not have been chemically warranted. The most opium-forward of the early patent preparations was a product called diacodium, a syrup of poppies sold as a cough remedy, available from apothecaries across England and stocked, without special distinction, among the ordinary remedies of the domestic cabinet. What all these preparations shared was the promise of relief without the requirement of diagnosis. You did not need a physician to purchase them. You did not need to describe your symptoms to anyone with medical training, to submit to an examination, to wait for a prescription. You needed money, access to a shop, and a condition that inconvenienced you sufficiently to motivate a purchase. For a society in which a physician's consultation cost considerably more than a bottle of patent medicine, a consultation with a London physician in the 1740s might cost several shillings, while a bottle of laudanum cost 2p. This was not a small distinction. It meant that the decision about what to take and how much and for how long was made by the patient rather than the practitioner, and that the patient therefore bore both the benefit and the risk without professional guidance. The patient, in a great many cases, was a woman. The domestic medicine chest was a female domain, in the sense that the management of the household's health fell, by default, within the sphere of domestic labour that Victorian and earlier society assigned to women. The household management manuals of the 18th century, works like Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery, which also contained medical recipes, or the various domestic encyclopedias published across the 1700s, addressed the woman of the house as the primary medical decision-maker for her family. She nursed the children through fevers. She managed the servants' minor ailments. She determined, through a combination of experience, folk knowledge, and whatever medical publications had filtered down to her reading, what the household should take when something went wrong. This gave women a relationship with laudanum that was both more intimate and more varied than the relationship of male patients with the substance. Women used it for themselves, certainly, for pain, for anxiety, for the grief that the 18th and 19th centuries produced in quantity through high rates of infant and child mortality, through the deaths of husbands in early middle age, through the ordinary losses of an ordinary life lived without the emotional vocabulary that a later period would make available. But they also used it as a managerial tool. They measured it for teething infants. They gave it to servants with persistent coughs. They pressed it on husbands incapacitated by gout. The bottle in the medicine chest was both a personal remedy and an instrument of household management, and women operated it in both registers simultaneously. The doses, inevitably, varied. The concentrations varied. The results varied. The 18th century produced a substantial medical literature on the dangers of opiate habituation. Thomas Dover, who published his own laudanum formula in 1732, a formula containing a larger quantity of raw opium than Sydenham's, was also one of the early writers to note that patients who used opium regularly became dependent on it in ways that made discontinuation difficult. John Jones, whose 1701 Mysteries of Opium Revealed described withdrawal symptoms with a precision that was remarkable for its time, had been available to physicians for most of the century. The information existed in print for those with access to medical libraries. But this literature circulated among physicians and did not substantially disturb the domestic medicine cabinet, for the simple reason that the women who managed the cabinet did not generally have access to medical journals. The warning and the bottle coexisted in the same century without one significantly affecting the other. The bottle was present. The warning was abstract. The pain was immediate. What the chemist sold in the 1700s was not substantially different from what the chemist had sold in the 1670s, but the scale of the trade had expanded considerably. London alone had hundreds of apothecaries by the mid-18th century, and the provinces had their own networks of dispensers, some trained to standards approaching those of the Society of Apothecaries, some not, most operating with considerable commercial independence from any formal regulatory body. The Society of Apothecaries, founded in 1617, had nominal authority over the London trade, but enforcement was inconsistent and prosecution for selling dangerous preparations was rare enough to be noteworthy when it occurred. Opium in its raw form was also sold, at markets, at docks, from travelling vendors who moved between country fairs with their stocks of spices and medicines and whatever else found buyers. In the fenlands of Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire, where malaria was endemic and poverty was chronic, raw opium was chewed as a daily maintenance remedy by agricultural labourers who had learned the habit from their parents and who described it, in the accounts that social investigators would later collect, as simply what people did in the fens. Virginia Berridge, in her foundational study Opium and the People, documented this regional tradition with care. It was distinct from the middle-class laudanum use of the drawing room socially and economically, but it drew from the same botanical source and produced the same physiological outcomes. By 1750, Britain was importing roughly 200,000 pounds of opium annually, a figure that would more than double by the early 19th century. Most of it came from Turkey, Smyrna opium, darker and more pungent than the Indian varieties that would later dominate, and it entered the country through the London docks with little ceremony, taxed at import and then sold through wholesale druggist networks to the retail trade. The East India Company would not establish its full control over the Indian opium production until the later decades of the century. Before that, the Turkish supply was primary, and it was traded through the same merchant networks that handled pepper and silk. The money involved was significant in aggregate, though the individual transactions were small. A London apothecary who stocked laudanum and its patent relatives was selling products with reliable demand and consistent turnover. Demand did not fluctuate with fashion or season in the way that luxury goods did. Pain was perennial, anxiety was perennial, grief was perennial. The customer who had developed a dependency, who needed the bottle not when pain struck but as a daily necessity, was a customer whose loyalty was guaranteed by chemistry rather than preference. This was not strategically lost on the trade, even if the commercial logic was rarely articulated in those terms. The concept of addiction as a condition that imposed genuine compulsion on the sufferer, rather than reflecting a moral choice to continue, had not yet been formulated with medical precision in the 18th century. What existed in its place was the concept of habit, a more neutral word that carried some moral weight, but did not necessarily imply pathology. A person with a laudanum habit was, in the language of the period, someone who had formed a strong custom. The custom might be regrettable, it was not, in the 18th century framework, a disease. By the time George III was on the throne, and the American colonies were becoming a problem, laudanum was so embedded in English domestic life that challenging its place would have required a cultural upheaval that nobody was particularly prepared to undertake. It was part of the fabric of management, the management of bodies, of households, of the ordinary suffering that ordinary life produced in unremarkable quantity. A world without it was, for most people alive in 1770, genuinely unimaginable. The bottle had been in the cabinet since before they were born. Their mothers had used it. Their grandmothers had used it. It would, they assumed, with the confidence of people who have never had reason to question their assumptions, remain exactly where it was. The concept of female complaint, as deployed in domestic manuals and in the early medical literature addressed to lay readers, was a category that absorbed a remarkable range of conditions without much differentiation between them. A woman who experienced monthly pain severe enough to keep her in bed for 2 days was experiencing something physiological and specific. A woman who found herself persistently exhausted after a second pregnancy and an infant death in the same year was experiencing grief and depletion that had a real cause. A woman who could not sleep for 3 weeks following a bereavement was experiencing a reaction that a modern clinician would recognize as acute stress response. All of these, in the vocabulary of the 18th and early 19th centuries, were varieties of female complaint. All of them were treated, in the domestic manual tradition, with much the same recommendation: warmth, rest, and a preparation of opium in appropriate quantity. The domestic manual tradition is worth taking seriously as a historical source, not least because it reveals what knowledge was considered appropriate for women to hold about their own bodies and their own treatments. The manuals addressed to women in the 18th century were not condescending in the way that might be assumed. They were practical, informative, and gave the woman of the house real guidance about a real domain of responsibility. But the practical information they contained was organized around management rather than investigation. The chapter on female complaints told you what to give and how much. It did not tell you why the complaint had arisen, or whether there was anything to be done about its cause. The assumption was that the cause was constitutionally female, and therefore not amenable to further inquiry. This assumption, that female suffering was a constitutional feature of female nature rather than a response to specific and potentially addressable circumstances, was so embedded in the domestic manual tradition that challenging it would have required a conceptual framework that the period did not have available. The framework would begin to develop tentatively in the latter decades of the 19th century, as women began to enter medical schools and as the public health movement generated the kind of systematic data that could distinguish between conditions that varied by circumstance and conditions that did not. But in the 18th century, the assumption was secure, and it gave laudanum its cultural warrant, the preparation that managed what could not otherwise be managed. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The nervousness of women. Victorian medicine had a theory of women. It was not a single unified theory, and it changed over the course of the century as new physiological knowledge accumulated and as some of its more extreme expressions became embarrassing. But its central propositions were consistent enough across decades and practitioners to constitute a system, that the female body was organized around the reproductive organs in a way the male body was not, that this organization made women constitutionally more sensitive, more volatile, and more prone to illness, that many of the ailments from which women suffered were expressions of this constitutional vulnerability rather than specific diseases with specific and treatable causes, and that the appropriate management in most cases was rest, quiet, and chemical suppression of whatever symptoms had presented at the consultation. The language used to describe this theory varied with the decade and the practitioner. The word hysteria, from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus, had been in medical use since antiquity, describing a range of conditions attributed to the womb's supposed instability and influence over the rest of the body. By the Victorian period, most physicians no longer believed the womb literally migrated through the body, as ancient physicians had maintained, but they continued to hold that uterine function had profound effects on the nervous system, and that disturbances of the nerves were the immediate cause of most female illness. The uterus in this framework was a kind of governing organ whose dysfunction cascaded outward through the body in ways that produced the full range of symptoms that female patients brought to their doctors. Neurasthenia was another diagnostic category in wide use by the 1870s, coined by the American neurologist George Beard in 1869, and taken up rapidly by British practitioners who found it usefully broad. Beard described neurasthenia as a depletion of nervous energy caused by the stresses of modern life, the pace of industrial civilization, the demands of competitive society, the overstimulation of the modern mind. He believed it affected both sexes, but his case studies and his cultural framing consistently emphasized women, particularly educated women, women who read too much or thought too hard about things that were beyond the natural domain of female intellect. The treatment he recommended included rest from mental exertion, removal from stimulating environments, the cessation of intellectual work, and, in cases where symptoms were severe, the chemical suppression of the most distressing symptoms. These theories were held sincerely by most of the physicians who applied them. The problem was not malice, but something more deeply embedded: the assumptions about female nature that had been built into medical education and medical culture over generations, and which had the authority of long consensus behind them. To observe a woman in pain and attribute that pain to her nervous constitution was, for a Victorian physician, not a failure of observation but an application of training. The training had been developed by men who had inherited it from men before them, drawing on a long tradition of medical thought that located female vulnerability at the centre of female biology. The tradition was wrong about mechanism. It was quite confident about consequence. What this meant in practice was that a woman presenting to her doctor with persistent headaches, or with anxiety following a bereavement, or with the fatigue that did not resolve after what the physician considered adequate rest, was unlikely to be investigated for specific physical causes of her symptoms with the same thoroughness applied to a male patient of the same economic class. She was more likely to receive a label: nervous complaint, hysterical disorder, neurasthenia, spinal irritation, and a prescription. The label and the prescription together constituted the treatment. The underlying cause of her symptoms, whatever it was, remained in place and continued to produce what it had always produced. Laudanum was the prescription most commonly associated with female nervous complaint across the middle decades of the Victorian period, though it was not the only one. Bromide of potassium, introduced as a sedative in the 1850s, was also widely prescribed. It was cheaper even than laudanum and produced a reliable sedation, though its long-term effects, chronic intoxication, skin eruptions, and a particular kind of cognitive dulling that was described by contemporary physicians as bromism, were eventually recognized as significant. Chlorodyne, the preparation containing laudanum, chloroform, and cannabis tincture, was fashionable through the 1870s and 1880s. But laudanum was the first reach, the standard, the thing that had been in the pharmacopoeia since before the physician himself was born. Its properties made it, from a Victorian physician's perspective, nearly ideal for the management of female nervous complaint. It suppressed pain, whatever its cause. It reduced anxiety without requiring the physician to understand the anxiety's origins. It quieted the emotional volatility that nervous theory attributed to female biology, producing a patient who was calmer, more tractable, less demanding of the physician's interpretive resources. It worked quickly and reliably at therapeutic doses, and it was cheap enough that patients of middling means could afford to maintain it. A bottle of laudanum in 1855 cost 2p to 4p at most chemists. A prescription was not legally required. The patient could purchase it herself, which was, in many cases, what she eventually did. The women who received these prescriptions were not in the main, in any straightforward sense, deceived. They knew they were taking opium. The word laudanum carried no particular stigma in 1850 comparable to what the word opium would carry by 1900, and in any case most educated women of the middle classes knew what laudanum was, and had grown up in houses where it was kept. What they lacked was information about dependency, about the fact that the initial relief would require escalating doses to maintain, that stopping abruptly after months or years of use produced symptoms sometimes more distressing than the original complaint, that the pharmaceutical management of their nervousness was also, by degrees, the production of a new physiological condition that would require pharmaceutical management in turn. This information existed in the medical literature. It was not communicated at the consultation. The information asymmetry was structural rather than personal. The relationship between Victorian general practitioners and their female patients was shaped by assumptions about what women needed and what they could reasonably be expected to understand. The physician was the authority. The patient's role was to describe her symptoms and accept the treatment prescribed. The frank communication of pharmaceutical risk, the kind of conversation that a later medical culture would formalize as informed consent, was not part of the cultural script. The physician who had prescribed laudanum for 6 months and had not mentioned dependency was not, by the standards of his time, acting improperly. He was acting within a framework that did not require him to have that conversation. It is worth pausing on the word management, because it appears with notable frequency in the Victorian medical literature when the subject is female patients. The management of hysteria, the management of nervous symptoms, the management of the difficult case. Management implies a subject who cannot be left to their own devices, who requires an external controlling intelligence, applied with regularity and professional authority to prevent deterioration or worse. What Laudanum offered the physician was a tool of management that was portable, affordable, and in the short term, remarkably effective. The patient was quieter. The physician's time was not consumed by complaints that could not, in any case, be addressed by the medicine available. The consultation was brief. Both parties returned to their separate lives. The symptoms that women brought to physicians, and that were managed in this way, were various and real. Historians of Victorian women's health have documented in careful detail the physical conditions from which female patients suffered, conditions that were specific, treatable by modern standards, and routinely misattributed to nervous constitution: pelvic inflammatory disease, misdiagnosed as hysteria; thyroid disorders, whose symptoms of anxiety and irregular heartbeat presented as classic neurasthenia; the chronic pain of endometriosis, managed with laudanum for decades while the underlying condition advanced. These were not imaginary complaints. They were real diseases being treated with a suppressant rather than a cure, because the diagnostic tools to identify them did not exist, or because the physicians who could have investigated further did not think it necessary to do so. Into this clinical picture add the structural conditions of female life. The legal and economic situation of married women in Victorian England gave them essentially no independent financial existence before the Married Women's Property Act of 1882. A woman's property, on marriage, became her husband's property. She had no independent legal standing to sue or be sued, to enter contracts, to control her own earnings. Divorce was available, after 1857, through a civil court rather than an Act of Parliament, a genuine reform. But it remained prohibitively expensive for most women, and it required, for female petitioners, proof of adultery combined with additional grounds such as cruelty or desertion. Into this structure, middle-class women were born and in most cases remained. The pain some of them brought to their physicians was real physical pain, but some portion of what presented as nervous complaint was what a less medicalized vocabulary might call unhappiness. The unhappiness of a constrained life, of choices that were not choices, of suffering that had no medical address because its origin was not medical. Laudanum could not alter these conditions. What it could do was make the conditions more bearable, could soften the edges of a life that offered little that the person inside it had chosen. For many women, that was enough to make the bottle worth having. For many women, that was genuinely all that was on offer. By the 1870s, the pattern was well established and described in enough medical literature to be recognizable as a pattern. A woman in distress consulted a physician. The physician diagnosed nervous complaint. The physician prescribed laudanum or a related preparation. The patient took it, felt relief, and returned when the bottle was empty. The dependency, as it developed over months, produced its own symptoms: restlessness, insomnia, low mood when the dose was delayed, irritability shading toward distress, which were attributed to the original nervous condition rather than to the preparation prescribed for it. The prescription was renewed. The dose was sometimes increased. The dependency deepened while the original complaint remained, somewhere underneath the pharmaceutical management, unaddressed and unresolved. The word nervousness itself deserves attention. In the Victorian medical vocabulary, nervousness described not a vague disposition, but a specific pathological category, a condition of the nervous system characterized by heightened sensitivity, reduced tolerance for stimulation, and a consequent vulnerability to the disruptions that ordinary life produced. The nervous woman was not, in this framework, simply a woman who was anxious or upset. She was a woman whose nervous system had been destabilized in a way that required pharmaceutical support to restore to something approaching equilibrium. The framework made nervousness a medical fact rather than a social response, which meant that the treatment was pharmaceutical rather than circumstantial, addressing the state of the nervous system rather than the conditions that had disturbed it. The pharmaceutical address of nervousness was not unique to laudanum. The Victorian period produced a succession of substances that were deployed in the management of female nervous complaints, each arriving with its own claim to superiority over its predecessor. Chloroform, which had been introduced as an anaesthetic in 1847 by James Young Simpson, was used in more dilute preparations as a calming agent through the 1850s and 1860s. Bromide of potassium, whose sedative properties were discovered in the 1850s, became widely prescribed through the 1860s and 1870s and was considered safer than laudanum on the grounds that it did not produce the pleasant effects associated with opium, though its long-term use produced a distinctive syndrome of cognitive dulling and skin eruption that contemporary physicians called bromism. Chlorodyne, the preparation that combined laudanum with chloroform and cannabis tincture, occupied a fashionable middle ground for several decades. Each successive preparation was marketed in part as safer than what it followed. Each produced in long-term users its own version of the dependency it had been promoted as avoiding. The succession of these substances through the Victorian period and beyond has led some medical historians to describe a ratchet effect in the management of female nervous complaints. Each new generation of quieting agent was initially presented as the solution to the problems the previous generation had produced, until the problems of the new agent became visible enough to require a further replacement. The pattern did not originate with laudanum, and it did not end with it. What laudanum represents in the history of this pattern is the point of maximum integration into ordinary life, the moment when the pharmaceutical quieting of female distress was most completely normalized, most commercially embedded, and most medically endorsed. Understanding how that moment was reached is part of understanding how the pattern has been able to repeat itself across different molecules and different centuries. What the counter sold? The chemist's shop of Victorian England was a sensory experience before it was anything else. The smell arrived first, a composite of camphor and rosewater and something chemical and sharp. The smell of compounding, of things being made from other things in the back room, where the mortar and pestle and the glass measures and the tiny brass scales were kept. The light inside was particular. Coloured glass carboys sat in the front window, filled with red and blue and green solutions that served no pharmaceutical purpose but announced, to anyone passing on the street, that medicine was available within. The bottles on the shelves behind the counter were brown and amber and clear, arranged with a regularity that suggested both abundance and expertise. Behind the counter stood the chemist, or more precisely a man who called himself a chemist and whose actual qualifications ranged widely, depending on the decade and the location. The title was not legally protected until 1868, and even after the Pharmacy Act of that year established formal examination requirements, the transition was slow and the inspection irregular. Before 1868, anyone could open a shop and dispense whatever they chose to sell, at whatever price they could negotiate, without any requirement to demonstrate knowledge of what they were selling. After 1868, anyone who had been in trade before the Act was registered as a matter of course, creating a grandfather class of dispensers whose qualifications range from the genuinely rigorous to the essentially non-existent. Both kinds stood behind similar counters and sold from similar bottles. What these men sold in the middle decades of the Victorian period was a combination of prescribed medicines, proprietary preparations, and freely available substances that occupied no clear regulatory category and required no medical authority to purchase. Laudanum fell into this last class throughout most of the period. It was not a prescription-only drug. It was not a controlled substance. It sat on the shelf behind the counter with the same commercial logic as a jar of barley sugar or a tin of tooth powder. You asked for it. He sold it. The transaction required no documentation, no medical authority to have prescribed it, and, in most shops for most of the century, no conversation about dosage, duration, or the potential for anything beyond the immediate relief it was being purchased to provide. The commercial logic of laudanum was unusually straightforward, even by the standards of a trade not known for complication. It was cheap to stock, because raw opium was abundant in the wholesale market, and the conversion to tincture was well understood and simple to execute. It commanded a reliable retail price. A 1-ounce bottle of standard laudanum sold for between 2p and 4p at most chemists in the 1850s and 1860s, and the retail markup relative to the wholesale cost of opium was substantial. It generated repeat business with a reliability that few other products could match, for reasons that the physiology of opioid tolerance made inevitable. A customer who found the preparation effective returned for more and more frequently as tolerance developed. Regular customers often bought in larger quantities to reduce their per-unit cost. The chemistry of the substance and the economics of the trade were perfectly aligned. The patent medicine trade operated at a higher price point and with considerably more investment in presentation and marketing. Where plain laudanum was sold across the counter without ceremony and brown paper wrapping, the proprietary preparations had names, distinctive packaging, and advertising copy that ran in newspapers and on the walls of railway stations and in the pages of women's magazines. The advertising for these preparations was, by the standards of modern pharmaceutical regulation, extraordinary. Specific diseases were named and cures claimed. Testimonials from satisfied customers were printed alongside endorsements from physicians who had been paid or simply persuaded to lend their names, and the impression of scientific authority was constructed through the use of medical vocabulary without the requirement of medical evidence. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, imported from the United States from the 1840s onward and sold across Britain through chemist networks, was marketed specifically at mothers with teething infants. Its advertising copy, which appeared in women's magazines and on trade cards distributed by chemists, described it as perfectly safe in the hands of the most inexperienced person, and claimed it would relieve the child from pain, promote digestion, regulate the bowels, and soften the gums. It contained, per fluid ounce, approximately 65 milligrams of morphine sulfate, the primary alkaloid of opium, isolated first in 1804 by the German pharmacist Friedrich Sertner. Collis Brown's chlorodyne, introduced in the 1850s by a physician named John Collis Brown, who had developed the preparation while serving in India during a cholera outbreak, contained laudanum, chloroform, and cannabis tincture, and was marketed as a remedy for a range of conditions that encompassed cholera, diarrhea, neuralgia, asthma, and most other conditions the Victorian body could produce. The marketing for these preparations rarely mentioned opium or morphine explicitly, and when they did, the mention was handled with a confidence that neutralized any concern the customer might have felt. They were sold as soothing agents, as pain relievers, as remedies for the nerves. The word soothing appears with remarkable frequency in the advertising copy of the period. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Godfrey's cordial marketed as the mother's friend, Street's infant's quietness. And the language of soothing was the language of relief without specificity, of comfort without mechanism, of a product that produced a desired effect without requiring the customer to engage with the chemistry that produced it. Godfrey's cordial is worth particular attention, both for the longevity of its presence in the trade and for the demographic it served most consistently. It was a mixture of opium, treacle, and spices, the treacle both sweetening the preparation and, incidentally, providing some caloric value to the infants to whom it was most commonly given. It had been sold in England since at least the early 18th century and was available at price points accessible to working-class families at penny or twopenny quantities from both licensed chemists and informal neighbourhood suppliers. In the manufacturing towns of the north, in the textile districts of Lancashire and Yorkshire, where women worked long factory shifts and left their infants in the care of neighbours or older children, Godfrey's cordial was a standard management tool. A penny bottle, properly administered, could produce several hours of infant sleep. The practice was documented by poor law investigators in the 1840s, who noted it with concern but without the regulatory leverage to address it. The economics of the proprietary trade were considerable in aggregate. By the 1860s, the patent medicine industry in Britain was worth several £1 million annually, and its largest participants were national enterprises with advertising budgets sufficient to make newspaper proprietors reluctant to carry editorial content critical of preparations whose manufacturers were significant advertising clients. The relationship between the press and the patent medicine industry was documented by social reformers throughout the second half of the century, and it was a relationship that worked to the consistent disadvantage of accurate public information about the content and risks of the most widely sold preparations. Some chemists in the 1860s and 1870s kept informal records of their most frequent laudanum purchases and exercised a personal judgment about whether to continue selling to individuals who appeared to be consuming the preparation in quantities beyond what any therapeutic purpose could justify. A few wrote to local medical practitioners expressing concern about specific patients. These acts of individual conscience are documented here and there in the memoir literature of the late 19th century and in the oral history collections assembled in the early 20th. They were not systemic. They were the exceptions that the commercial incentive structure consistently worked against. A chemist who declined to sell laudanum on the grounds that repeated use might cause harm was a chemist who would lose customers to the shop across the street, which would not decline. The formal record of the trade shows something simpler than conscience: rising sales across the middle decades of the century. Opium imports into Britain grew steadily through the first half of the 19th century, peaking at somewhere between 200 and 300 tons per year in the 1860s. Not all of this was consumed domestically. A significant portion was re-exported, and the East India Company's forced opium trade with China was a separate and politically visible enterprise, but domestic consumption was rising too, tracked imperfectly through the records of wholesale druggists and the investigations of parliamentary committees. The system that produced these numbers was a cascade of interests, each of which found the trade beneficial, and none of which bore the primary cost. The opium farmer in Turkey or India, the shipping merchant, the wholesale druggist in London, the retail chemist, the patent medicine manufacturer who added flavouring and a label and a considerably higher price, the newspaper that ran the advertisement, the railway that distributed the product to every town on its network. Each node in the system profited from what happened at the next node, and the cost, the dependency, the damaged health, the children who slept too long and sometimes did not wake, was borne by the customer and her household, who were the end of the chain. At the end of the chain was the woman with her bottle. She was in many cases spending money she could not easily spare on something she had come to need in a way she had not anticipated when she first asked for it. The chemist knew her by name or by face, depending on the size of the town. The transaction was brief. She paid. He wrapped it in paper. She put it in her basket with the other things she had purchased that morning, and she walked home through the November air, and the bottle was in her basket, and the city was going about its ordinary business, and none of the ordinary business of the city was paying any particular attention to her. The pricing structure of laudanum across different classes of retail outlet illuminates something about how the trade understood its customer base. At the high end, a London chemist in a fashionable district might sell a small bottle of laudanum prepared to a slightly higher standard, more carefully measured concentration, better quality base alcohol, a label that implied pharmacological precision, for a price that reflected the neighbourhood as much as the product. In working-class districts, the same compound was available in larger volume at lower unit cost, because the working-class customer who bought in bulk was understood to be buying for domestic management over weeks rather than for a single dose. The patent preparations occupied a separate pricing tier entirely, commanding a significant premium for the branding and the advertising that came with names like Mrs. Winslow's or Godfrey's or Chlorodyne. What the customer was purchasing in each case was chemically similar. What she was purchasing in a social sense was different. In one case, a domestic staple; in another, a branded remedy with the implied authority of a named creator. The advertising that sustained the patent preparation market was, by the standards of modern pharmaceutical promotion, remarkable for its freedom from evidential constraint. Claims were made about specific diseases and specific outcomes without any requirement for clinical evidence. Testimonials from satisfied users were published without verification. The language of medical authority was borrowed and deployed by manufacturers who had no formal medical qualifications and no obligation to demonstrate that their products did what the advertising claimed. The newspaper proprietors who ran the advertising, and who depended on patent medicine advertising revenue for a significant portion of their income, did not exercise editorial oversight of the claims being made on their pages. The reform literature that accumulated through the 1880s and 1890s on the subject of patent medicine advertising eventually contributed to the legislative changes of the early 20th century. The Pharmacy Act Amendment Act of 1908 and, more substantially, the changes following the Sale of Food and Drugs Act amendments of the same decade, which began to require disclosure of active ingredients in proprietary preparations. But the path from the first medical journal articles documenting the harm of opiate-containing patent medicines to the legislation that required their honest labelling spanned more than half a century. Across that half-century, the products remained on the shelves and the advertising remained on the pages, and the women who purchased them did so in the absence of information that the manufacturers held and did not share. The letters they left. The history of laudanum's effects on individual women exists in letters and diaries and case notes and, occasionally, in published accounts by women who chose to describe their own experience in forms intended for others to read. These sources are uneven, partial, mediated by the conventions of their time. A Victorian woman writing about her use of laudanum in a private diary was writing in the awareness that diaries could be read by others, that the privacy of a Victorian diary was contingent rather than absolute, and the resulting self-censorship is often visible in the text as a particular kind of gap, a sentence that begins one way and ends differently, a subject approached and then withdrawn from, a habit mentioned once and never mentioned again. The gaps are informative in their own right. They show where the subject was too complicated to approach directly, even in private. Elizabeth Barrett was 38 years old when she wrote, in a letter to her friend Mary Russell Mitford in 1844, that she had been taking laudanum for a very long time, in doses that had increased gradually over the years, and that she was not certain she could now stop without considerable difficulty. She did not use the word dependent. She did not use the word addicted. The word in its modern sense would not enter common English usage until the latter decades of the century, when the medical concept had crystallized sufficiently to generate everyday vocabulary. She said she'd come to rely on it in a way that she was not proud of, and then she changed the subject, with the efficiency of a woman who has been managing something for a long time, and has learned that dwelling on it in correspondence does not help. Barrett had begun using laudanum in the 1820s, initially prescribed by her physician for a lung condition that may have been tuberculosis, or may have been the spinal injury she sustained in her early 20s. The medical record is uncertain on this point, and Barrett herself was inconsistent across her correspondence about the nature of her original complaint. What is clear is that by her early 30s she was taking it daily, managing her own doses with the practical expertise of long experience, and that her famous invalidism, her confinement to her room in the family house on Wimpole Street for much of the late 1830s and 1840s, was entangled with her laudanum use in ways that neither she nor her biographers have been able to fully separate from the underlying physical illness. Robert Browning, who began corresponding with her in 1845 and married her in 1846 in a clandestine ceremony conducted while her father was out of the house, wrote to her about the laudanum with a combination of genuine concern and very careful tact. He did not demand she stop. He did not moralize. He expressed in letters that navigated the subject with the delicacy of a man who understood that the subject was complicated, the hope that she might reduce her doses in the warmer climate of Italy, where they moved after their marriage. After they arrived in Florence, where the sun was consistent and the cold of Wimpole Street was gone, the doses did reduce. Not to zero. She continued to use laudanum until her death in 1861, at the age of 55, but to something more moderate than the quantities that had maintained her through the years of confinement. She wrote to Mitford in a letter from 1849 that she was better in Italy than she had been anywhere else, and that the drops were fewer. Florence Nightingale presents a different case, and one that complicates any simple narrative about the effects of long-term laudanum use on female productivity and function. Nightingale began using laudanum in the 1850s. She herself attributed the beginning of her use to the Crimean fever she contracted in 1855, which left her with a chronic fatigue that she managed, alongside other remedies, with opiate preparations for the rest of her life. She lived to 90. Her relationship with laudanum across those decades was not one of increasing incapacity, but of a managed dependency that coexisted with an output of written work and institutional influence that was extraordinary by any measure. She spent most of the last 40 years of her life in her bedroom in South Street, London, receiving visitors on the sofa, directing the reform of military and civilian nursing from a position of deliberate physical withdrawal. She wrote, from this bedroom, several hundred reports, pamphlets and letters that transformed hospital management across the British Empire and influenced the development of nursing as a formal profession. The relationship between her reclusiveness, her laudanum use, and the genuine illness that had disabled her has been debated by her biographers without resolution. What is documented is that she managed her own doses with precision, that her physicians prescribed and renewed the preparation she requested, and that the laudanum coexisted with, or possibly enabled, her remarkable late-life productivity rather than ending it. She was not incapacitated by the drug, she was organized around it. The accounts of women who are not in biographies, women who are in county record offices and local history collections and the margins of other people's archives, show different patterns. The historian Virginia Berridge, whose 1981 study Opium and the People remains the most thorough account of Victorian opiate consumption, assembled from disparate archival sources, a portrait of ordinary female laudanum use that is both more common and more varied than the literary record alone suggests. The diary of a Sheffield tradesman's wife from the 1870s records her own use in entries that become progressively shorter and less detailed as the decade advances, as though the subject requires fewer words the longer it continues. The letters of a Cornish farmer's daughter written to her sister across the early 1880s describe, with notable practical clarity, a situation that had developed gradually and was now difficult to address. The Cornish woman's letters are worth dwelling on, not for any dramatic detail, but for their steadiness. She describes her situation with the same practical vocabulary she applies to descriptions of the harvest, the price of wool, the condition of the farm buildings. She has been taking laudanum for 7 years, she writes, initially prescribed after a difficult third childbirth. She needs it now in a way she did not need it then. She describes the feeling when she delays the dose as a wretchedness she cannot function through. She would like to stop. She does not know how to stop, and she's not certain that her doctor, who prescribed it in the first place, has anything useful to offer on the question. She asks her sister if she knows of anything. Her sister's reply does not survive in the collection. We have only the one letter, the need, the question, the practical tone that is somehow more affecting than a more distressed tone would be. The Cornish woman understood what had happened to her with a clarity that many patients lacked. She did not romanticize her situation. She did not attribute it to weakness of character in the way that some of the medical literature of the period encouraged. She attributed it to the preparation she had been given, which had done what it was supposed to do, and then had done something additional that she had not been told to expect. The attribution was accurate. The information she had lacked had been available in the medical literature since John Jones had published The Mysteries of Opium Revealed in 1701. The physician who had prescribed laudanum to the Cornish woman and to the countless women in similar situations across the mid-Victorian period was not, in the main, acting from bad faith. He was applying a standard of care that the professional culture around him endorsed, using a preparation whose risks he may have been aware of in the abstract but did not consider sufficiently serious to communicate at the consultation. The communication of pharmaceutical risk. The frank conversation about what might happen if a patient took a preparation regularly for months or years was not part of the clinical culture that Victorian general practice had developed for female patients. The consultation was brief. The prescription was the outcome. The outcome was considered a success if the patient left feeling better than she had arrived. The case notes that survive from Victorian general practitioners, and they survive in sufficient quantity to allow some generalizations, show the pattern across patients and decades. A woman presented with a complaint. Laudanum was prescribed. The prescription was renewed. The dose, in several documented cases, increased over time, as the physician noted that the original dosage was no longer providing adequate relief. The original complaint receded from the notes and was replaced, in some cases, by a new notation: established habit, or the habit well advanced, or the patient has become accustomed to the preparation. The physician continued to prescribe not because he believed the habit was beneficial, but because discontinuing it would produce symptoms that no one wanted to manage, and that the system of care had no good tools for addressing. The casebook of a Birmingham physician named James Sire, who practiced in the jewellery quarter across the 1870s and 1880s, and who kept notes more detailed than most of his contemporaries, contains an entry from 1879 that is distinctive in its candour. A woman, her name is recorded in the casebook but is not reproduced here, who had been using laudanum for 12 years, came to him not for a renewal of her prescription, but to ask whether there was any way to stop. She described herself as a prisoner of the preparation, which is one of the more vivid phrases in the available record. She said she would not have begun if she'd known what would happen. Sire recorded, without editorializing, that he had no doubt this was true, and that the information she would have needed to make a different decision had been available in the medical literature since at least the 1840s. Sire does not record what he prescribed her, or whether his prescription differed from any previous practitioners. His casebook continues for another decade, but her name does not appear again. She came to him once, with a question. The question had an answer, somewhere, in the tapering regimens that some practitioners were beginning to describe, in the inebriate retreats that were beginning to offer residential care for opiate-dependent patients. But the answer was not yet organised into anything that a Birmingham general practitioner in 1879 could reliably access and apply. She went back to her life. The city continued. The casebook moved to its next entry. What she did about her question, whether she found an answer, whether she continued, whether the 12 years extended to 20, the record does not say. She's there in the archive for a single conversation, a single notation, and then she's absorbed back into the ordinary life of a Victorian city that contained, in its back bedrooms and medicine cabinets, and in the accounts of chemists who knew their regular customers by face if not by name, more of her story than it knew how to tell. The language available to Victorian women for describing their experience of laudanum dependency was limited by the diagnostic categories through which the experience was being processed. The word addiction was not in common lay or medical use until the 1870s, and even then it was used inconsistently, sometimes denoting a moral habit and sometimes a physiological condition, with the medical literature of the period still debating whether the distinction was meaningful. The women who described their situation in letters and diaries were working without a vocabulary that had yet been designed for what they were describing. They used what was available, the word habit, with its suggestion of custom, the word reliance with its suggestion of a reasonable dependence. The word prisoner, which the Birmingham woman used, was unusually precise. It indicated compulsion, the absence of choice, the condition of being held by something that the will could not release. But it was metaphorical rather than clinical, and it carried no diagnostic implications. The gap between the experience and the vocabulary available to describe it is one of the persistent themes in the history of dependency as a medical and social phenomenon. The experience, the mounting need, the physical distress of delay, the narrowing of the day around the management of access to the preparation, was real and consistent across different women in different decades and different social positions. The vocabulary that would eventually be developed to describe this experience, tolerance, withdrawal, physical dependence, compulsion, was assembled slowly across the last decades of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th, from the contributions of physicians like Norman Kerr and organisations like the Society for the Study and Cure of Inebriety, who were willing to argue that what they were observing was a medical condition with a medical name. The women in the letters and diaries were ahead of the vocabulary, in the sense that they were experiencing something that did not yet have an adequate description. They found words for it as best they could. The Cornish woman wrote wretchedness. The Sheffield tradesman's wife wrote progressively shorter entries until the subject disappeared from the diary entirely, which is its own kind of description. Elizabeth Barrett wrote that she relied on it in a way she was not proud of, and then changed the subject. Each of these is a different strategy for describing something for which the available language was inadequate. The inadequacy of the language was itself part of the situation. It made the thing harder to name, harder to discuss with physicians who also lacked the vocabulary, harder to address as a problem that had a solution rather than a condition that simply continued. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. Mrs. Winslow's Children. There is a trade card from the 1860s, preserved in the Wellcome collection in London, that advertises Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for children teething. The illustration shows a woman in a domestic interior, calm and composed, attending to an infant in a manner that suggests confidence and competence rather than distress. The text promises immediate relief from pain and inflammation of the gums. The tagline reads, "Perfectly safe in the hands of the most inexperienced person." The card was printed in large quantities and distributed by chemists across Britain and in the colonial markets where British commercial interest carried it. It is a carefully constructed document of reassurance. The science it invokes is the science of simplicity. The preparation works, the child is calmer, the mother can rest. Charlotte Winslow was an American woman who had trained as a nurse midwife in New England in the 1820s and 1830s. She developed a preparation for teething infants over the course of her practice, initially compounded for her own patients, that she began selling commercially in the 1840s through a business arrangement with her son-in-law Jeremiah Curtis, a businessman with the marketing sensibility that Charlotte Winslow the midwife lacked. The formula was never publicly disclosed. Proprietary preparations in this period guarded their formulas as trade secrets, since the formula was essentially the product, but chemical analyses conducted by investigators in the 1880s and 1890s, as the regulatory conversation began to require more transparency, found that a standard bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup contained, per fluid ounce, approximately 65 milligrams of morphine sulfate. A standard recommended dose for an infant was 1 teaspoon, delivering approximately 10 to 15 milligrams of morphine. The recommended dosing interval, for continued relief, was every 3 hours. The preparation was effective in the sense that it reliably stopped the infant from crying, produced sleep, and allowed mothers and caregivers to attend to other things. The mechanism, profound central nervous system depression in an organism whose nervous system was not yet fully developed and whose respiratory regulation was consequently more vulnerable to pharmacological interference than an adult's, was not described in the advertising copy. The result was described. A baby that had been fractious through a teething night would, after a dose of Mrs. Winslow's, fall into a sleep so complete that the mother might sleep herself. In a household where rest was necessary and the alternatives for managing infant pain were limited to what a pre-pharmaceutical era offered, this was not a trivial benefit. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was the best known of the class but was far from the only preparation of its kind. Godfrey's cordial, which had been sold in England since at least the early 18th century, contained a mixture of opium, treacle and assorted spices at concentrations that varied between manufacturers and were rarely disclosed to customers. Dalby's carminative, sold primarily as a treatment for infant colic, also contained opium in varying amounts, Street's infant's quietness, Atkinson's infant's preservative, Steedman's soothing powders, McMunn's elixir of opium. The names were numerous, the formulas varied, and the pharmacological core was the same across all of them. They were opiate preparations in small bottles with reassuring labels, marketed to the primary purchasers of infant remedies, who were women. The scale of their use in working-class communities was documented with a consistency that suggests the practice was widespread rather than unusual. The concentration of working mothers in factory employment in the textile districts of Lancashire and Yorkshire created both the clearest commercial demand and the most visible social consequences. A woman who worked a 12-hour shift at a cotton mill could not bring her infant to the factory floor. She could leave the infant with a neighbour or an older child, but she needed the infant to be manageable, which meant, in the vocabulary of the period, quiet. Godfrey's cordial was the cheapest and most available quieting agent. A penny bottle, properly divided across the day, could produce what the trade advertised and what mothers needed. An infant who slept while the mother worked. Edwin Chadwick's report on the sanitary conditions of the labouring population, published in 1842, noted the use of opiate preparations on infants in factory towns as part of a broader investigation into conditions that contributed to the high mortality rates of the period. The Registrar General's annual reports on causes of death, which began with some consistency in 1837, showed infant mortality rates in the manufacturing districts of Lancashire and the West Riding of Yorkshire that were substantially higher than the national average and substantially higher than the rates in rural areas where factory employment was less common. The causes were multiple and overlapping: contaminated water, inadequate nutrition, overcrowding, the absence of breastfeeding mothers during working hours, and opiate administration was one among them, difficult to separate from the others in the aggregate data. Opiate preparations did not appear on Victorian death certificates as a direct cause of death in the way that cholera or smallpox appeared. When an infant died in circumstances consistent with opiate overdose, the unrousable sleep, the slowing of breathing, the gradual quieting, the cause was recorded, if it was recorded at all, as convulsions, as debility, as marasmus, a catch-all term for wasting, or as overlaying, the imprecise term for the accidental or deliberate smothering of an infant by an adult sharing a bed. These categories were capacious and their application was inconsistent. The medical officer who inspected the body of a working-class infant in a Lancashire mill town in 1855 was working with limited tools, limited time, and a classification system that had not been designed to capture the specific kind of death that opiate suppression of respiratory function produced. The investigators who pursued the question despite these limitations, medical officers of health, public health reformers, the physicians who contributed to the medical press, found enough evidence to raise the alarm, even if the evidence was not precise enough to produce legislation. The Lancet published an analysis of infant remedies in 1858 that identified the opiate content of the most widely sold preparations and estimated the doses at which they became dangerous. A follow-up investigation in 1868 noted that the preparations had not changed in the decade since the earlier warning. The British Medical Journal published reports from local medical officers in the textile districts describing specific cases in which they believed opiate preparations had contributed to infant deaths and calling for legislative action. The legislative action was slow. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 required that preparations containing opium be labelled with the word poison and sold only by registered chemists, but the requirement applied to the retail chemist, not to the informal neighbourhood seller who supplied Godfrey's cordial to working-class families from her own front room. And the labelling requirement did not prevent sales, it merely added a word to the bottle. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was, technically, required to carry a poison label after 1868. Whether it consistently did so depended on whether the particular bottle had been dispensed by a registered chemist or purchased through another channel. The regulation was real, the enforcement was not. The women who gave Godfrey's cordial and Mrs. Winslow's to their infants were not, in the great majority of cases, acting from indifference or negligence. They were acting within the knowledge available to them, in conditions that gave them few alternatives. A factory worker who could not afford to stop working, who had no alternative childcare, who understood from everything around her that the cordial was a legitimate domestic remedy used by every woman she knew, was not making an irresponsible choice. She was making the choice that the available options allowed. The information that would have changed her choice, the information about morphine content, about respiratory depression, about the vulnerability of infant nervous systems, was not on the label. It was not available to her. The physicians who wrote about the infant opiate problem in the 1860s and 1870s did not, in general, direct their criticism at the mothers who gave the preparations. They directed it at the commercial system that made the preparations available and at the regulatory system that allowed them to continue without scrutiny. This was, in retrospect, the appropriate direction. The mother with her penny bottle of Godfrey's cordial was the end of a supply chain that ran from opium poppy fields in Turkey and India through merchant networks and wholesale druggists to the patent medicine manufacturers and retail chemists who sold the final product with a label that said nothing useful about what was inside. The children who survived infancy in these conditions, the working-class children of factory towns who had been administered opiate preparations regularly in their first years of life, were not studied in any systematic way for long-term effects. The medical technology and the institutional infrastructure for such a study did not exist. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that regular exposure to opiate preparations in infancy affects neurological development, that the doses administered were not calibrated to infant weight or stage of development, and that the effects of this exposure, if any, were not tracked by anyone in a position to identify them. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup continued to be sold in Britain until 1930, when a Board of Trade order finally required the removal of its opiate content. By that date, the regulatory and cultural landscape had changed sufficiently that the original formula was no longer tenable even commercially. It was, by 1930, something that required concealment rather than advertising. The trade card in the Welcome collection, with its composed mother and its peaceful infant and its assurance of perfect safety, belongs to an earlier understanding of what safety meant and what the body of an infant was able to absorb. It is not a cynical document, it is a confident one. The confidence was the problem. The preparation worked. The infant slept. The mothers, in the hours bought by the sleep, worked or rested or attended to the other children, or simply sat down for the first time that day. The harm was real, but it was distributed and delayed and not always visible, and in a culture that did not yet have the investigative tools or the regulatory will to make it visible, it continued. The bottle was cheap. The sleep was real. The morning came, and the infant woke, or did not wake, and the day went on. The question of what working-class mothers actually knew about the preparations they used on their infants, and what they would have done differently with better information, is one that the historical record can only partially answer. The oral history evidence collected in the early 20th century from women who had been mothers in the 1870s and 1880s suggests a range of awareness. Some women described the cordials as medicines, without understanding that they contained opium. Others described them with a directness that suggests they understood the pharmacological category, if not the specific chemistry. A woman interviewed in the 1930s by a social historian working on the history of working-class family life described giving Godfrey's cordial to her infants in the 1880s as simply what you did, what your own mother had done, what the woman down the street did, what the health visitor, when there was one, did not tell you to stop doing because stopping was impractical and starting would have required having something else to put in its place. The health visitors who began operating in factory districts in the 1880s and 1890s, initially through voluntary organisations and later through local government sanitary authorities, were among the first professional intermediaries between the prescribing culture and the families it affected, who were actually present in working-class homes on a regular basis. The health visitor who called at a terraced house in a Lancashire mill town and found an infant smelling faintly of treacle and difficult to rouse was in a position to observe what the physician in his consulting room was not. The records of the health visiting organisations, where they survive from this period, contain references to the opiate preparations that suggest an awareness of the problem and a limited ability to address it. The visitor could advise, could express concern, could refer to a medical officer of health. She could not prevent the purchase of a preparation that was legally available at the shop on the corner. The eventual restriction of opiate-containing infant preparations was not the result of any single intervention, not the Pharmacy Act of 1868, not the medical journal investigations of the 1870s, not the health visiting records, not the parliamentary debates. It was the result of the accumulation of these things over decades, combined with the gradual shift in public understanding of what opium was and what it did, that made the original advertising of Mrs. Winslow's and Godfrey's cordial increasingly difficult to maintain. The word poison on the bottle, required after 1868, did not by itself change the purchasing decision. But it was a beginning, the first official acknowledgement printed on the label itself that the preparation the mother was giving to her infant had a category of risk that required naming. Pleasures and pains. In 1821, a periodical called the London Magazine published a two-part series of essays under the title Confessions of an English Opium Eater. The author gave his name as Thomas de Quincey, and he was 35 years old, a journalist and essayist who had been using laudanum since 1804, when a toothache had first driven him to a chemist on Oxford Street in London, and produced what he later described as one of the most significant events of his intellectual life. The Confessions were an immediate popular success. They were reprinted in book form the following year and went through multiple editions across the following decades. They established for a generation of English readers the literary vocabulary of opium, its pleasures catalogued with philosophical precision, its torments described with what readers took to be unflinching honesty, its relationship to memory and time and the architecture of the mind made available as aesthetic experience. De Quincey wrote about laudanum as a philosopher and literary stylist, not as a patient reporting symptoms to a physician, or as a moralist accounting for a sin. His prose was elaborate, self-consciously rhetorical, designed to produce effects in the reader that corresponded to the effects he described in himself. He wrote about the pleasure of laudanum with a precision that had no equivalent in anything a physician of the period had produced. The sense of expanded space and elasticated time, the way ordinary domestic sounds, rain against the window, the movement of a fire, the sound of a church clock, acquired a significance and a clarity they did not normally carry, as though the attention had been polished to a new transparency. He described also the nightmares that came later, the digestive torment, the progressive difficulty of ordinary movement, the decline of capability that accumulated across years of heavy use. He did not suppress the dark material. He subjected it to literary organisation, which was both more honest than silence and considerably more aesthetically interesting. The Confessions created a cultural problem that would persist for decades. By making opium interesting, by treating the experience of opiate use as something worth describing at length, something with genuine philosophical and aesthetic dimensions, something that produced material for literature, De Quincey gave the substance a cultural elevation that complicated any straightforward public health argument against it. It was difficult to argue that laudanum was simply a dangerous commodity when the most celebrated account of its use was also one of the most admired pieces of English prose in a generation. The reform literature that accumulated through the 1860s and 1870s had to work against the literary tradition as well as against the prescribing culture and the commercial trade. Samuel Taylor Coleridge had been using laudanum since the 1790s, Initially prescribed for the rheumatic pain that plagued him intermittently from his time at Cambridge, his use is woven through his creative life and his correspondence in ways that have been argued over by literary scholars for 2 centuries, and the arguments have not fully resolved. Kubla Khan, which Coleridge claimed to have composed in a half-sleep, following a dose of laudanum in 1797, is the most famous specific literary work attributed to the drug. Though Coleridge's own account of the poem's composition changed over the years, the published note about the dream and the interruption that ended it was added to the poem more than a decade after it was written, and the relationship between the laudanum and the poem's extraordinary imagery is probably not reducible to a single cause. What is documented without ambiguity is that Coleridge was a heavy long-term user of laudanum, that he attempted to stop repeatedly and with consistent failure, and that he described his experience of dependency with a candour that was unusual for his time and social position. His letters about laudanum, and there are many of them, addressed to friends, patrons, and physicians across 3 decades, constitute one of the more complete records of opiate dependency available for the period. They are not literary performances, these letters. They are distressed communications from a man who understood what had happened to him and could not alter it. He wrote to John Morgan in 1814 that he was entirely without power over himself in this respect, that the force that kept him taking the preparation was not preference but compulsion, that he would give anything to be free of it. He tried various modes of reducing his intake and submitted himself to the supervision of physicians, including James Gilman, with whom he lived in Highgate for the last 18 years of his life. He died in 1834, having used laudanum for more than 40 years, under Gilman's care, but not, it appears, in materially reduced quantities. The literary representation of opium in the early 19th century was, with a few significant exceptions, a masculine literary tradition. The experiences that De Quincey and Coleridge made available for public consumption, the philosopher's extended pleasure, the tormented genius struggling with a substance that had become more powerful than his will, were the experiences of men writing for an educated male readership, and they carried the authority and the cultural space that the period allocated to male intellectual production. The women who used laudanum in the same decades were not, in general, producing literary accounts of the experience. They were managing households and raising children and writing letters to sisters rather than to publishers. This does not mean women were absent from the literary record of opium. Mary Robinson, the poet and actress who had been a mistress of the Prince of Wales in her youth, and who spent the later decades of her life in chronic pain, following a severe illness that partially paralysed her, wrote about her use of laudanum in her posthumously published memoir with a directness that contrasts with the elaborate literary framework De Quincey would bring to the same subject 2 decades later. Robinson described the preparation in practical terms. It helped with the pain. She used it regularly. She was uncertain what her situation would be without it. Her account lacks the transcendent register of the male opium writers of the period, the philosophical ambition, the claim to cultural significance. She describes a medical circumstance rather than a spiritual condition. This has perhaps contributed to the relative obscurity of her account in the literary history of the subject. Elizabeth Siddal, the artist and model who was a central figure in the pre-Raphaelite circle, the wife of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, was prescribed laudanum for a chronic digestive condition in the 1850s and was using it heavily by the early 1860s. Her death in February 1862 was attributed by the inquest to an accidental overdose, though Rossetti and those close to the household were troubled by the possibility that it had not been accidental, and the question was not definitively resolved by the inquest. She was 32 years old. Her own paintings and drawings, which showed a consistent interest in female figures in states of suspension, drowning, sleeping, waiting at the threshold between waking and some other condition, are sometimes read in retrospect through the lens of her laudanum use. This interpretive move has the appeal of apparent coherence, but it also risks collapsing her artistic production into her biography in a way that her male contemporary's work was rarely treated. The gendering of the opium literary tradition, men writing philosophy from the inside of the experience, women being managed or mourned or observed from outside it, reflects the broader asymmetry of Victorian cultural life rather than any actual difference in the subjective experience of the drug. Laudanum did not produce different chemical effects in female bodies than in male ones. What it produced differently was the social meaning of the use, the access to literary expression about the use, and the cultural permission to make that expression available to other readers. A woman who took laudanum daily in 1855 and found it both necessary and troubling was occupying essentially the same neurological territory as Coleridge. She was considerably less likely to be given the cultural space to write about it, and less likely, if she did write, to find a publisher who considered her experience worth the reader's time. The periodical press that reached middle-class women in the Victorian period, the ladies' magazines, the household management publications, the religious weeklies that formed the backbone of female reading, did not address laudanum dependency with the literary complexity that De Quincey had brought to the subject. When it addressed the subject at all, it did so through the mode of cautionary narrative, a woman who relied too heavily on her drops, whose face grew pale and whose household became disordered, whose children suffered from inattention, who was eventually found by her husband in a condition of evident intoxication and had to be managed through a period of painful recovery. These were moral tales of domestic failure, not philosophical explorations of altered consciousness. The lesson they offered was different from De Quincey's lesson, not that opium opened extraordinary regions of the mind, but that a woman who used it excessively had failed in her primary duties. De Quincey's Confessions were reissued, substantially revised and expanded in 1856. The revision reflected a changing public mood in which the open acknowledgement of opiate pleasure required more careful framing than it had in 1821. The 1856 edition added material that contextualized the pleasures within a more emphatic framework of eventual suffering, and it included a section titled The Pains of Opium that balanced what the original had called the pleasures, with an account of degradation and incapacity. The pleasures were still present in the revised text. They were not suppressed or denied, but they were more carefully embedded in a structure that offered suffering as the inevitable outcome, providing the moral resolution that the original, more formally experimental text had withheld. De Quincey himself continued to use laudanum until his death in Edinburgh in 1859. He had managed his habit, if managing is the right word for a relationship that lasted 55 years, and produced the famous Confessions, a substantial body of literary criticism, and a persistent financial instability, with the resources of a man who had the cultural authority to present his dependency as a subject of philosophical interest rather than moral failure. He was, in this sense, sheltered from the kind of judgment that the cautionary tales in women's magazines directed at their female subjects. His opium use made him interesting. Their opium use made them cautionary. The poets and the philosophers had done their work by the middle of the century. They had made laudanum culturally visible in a way that the domestic medicine cabinet alone could not have achieved. They had also, by making it intellectually romantic, built a cultural frame around the substance that made it more difficult to address as a straightforward public health problem. The reform literature had to work against this frame, as well as against the commercial trade and the prescribing culture. The frame did not make the reform impossible. It made it slower, more contested, more dependent on accumulating evidence of harm than any single argument about risk. The harm was accumulating. But the literature was there too, and De Quincey wrote very well. The Long Afternoon. By 1865, Britain was importing more opium per capita than it had at any previous point in its recorded history. The numbers are imprecise because customs records of the period tracked gross weight of raw opium imports, but not the many manufactured forms in which it subsequently circulated, and because the domestic consumption figures for a substance sold without documentation were necessarily estimates rather than measurements. But historians working from wholesale druggist records, pharmacy account books, the estimates of contemporary investigators, and the Registrar General's reports on causes of death have concluded with reasonable confidence that per capita consumption of opiate preparations in Britain peaked somewhere in the decade between 1860 and 1870. This was the high water mark, the moment when laudanum's integration into ordinary English life was most complete and most confident, and also the moment when the pressures that would eventually begin to shift that integration were quietly assembling. The peak consumption corresponded with a specific and, in retrospect, fragile configuration of factors. The wholesale price of opium was low, sustained by the expansion of production in India and the efficiency of the East India Company's commercial infrastructure. The retail infrastructure was extensive, unregulated and competitive in ways that kept prices accessible. The medical culture of female management through pharmaceutical quieting was at or near its fullest expression of confidence, bolstered by the authority of the nervous theory that had been built into medical education across 3 generations. And the public discourse around laudanum had not yet been substantially disrupted by the reform movements, the regulatory debates, and the medical dissent that would emerge more forcefully in the following decade. The first significant legislative response to the question of how opium should be controlled came from a direction that might not have been predicted, from the professional anxieties of a trade organisation rather than from the public health arguments that had been accumulating since the 1840s. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 was the product of nearly a decade of lobbying by the Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain, founded in 1841 to establish and protect the professional identity of pharmacists as a distinct skilled trade, separate from both medical practice and the unqualified selling of remedies. The Pharmaceutical Society wanted formal recognition and legal protection. The path to legal protection ran through regulation. The Act required that opium and a specified list of other dangerous substances including arsenic, prussic acid and the isolated alkaloids of opium, morphine, codeine, and the recently synthesized heroin would come later, be sold only by registered pharmaceutical chemists or by medical practitioners authorized to dispense. Sales were to be recorded in a book. Each preparation was to carry the word poison on its label. These were, in principle, meaningful restrictions on the existing trade. In practice, the implementation was considerably more modest than the principle suggested. The registration requirement meant that buyers were asked for their name and address, and that the sale was recorded in the poison register. It did not mean that the register was checked against any list of concerning purchasers, or cross-referenced with other chemists' registers, or reviewed by any inspector with the authority to intervene. A customer who gave a false name, or who simply gave a name that the chemist wrote down without verification, was in no practical danger of being identified. The register was a document of commerce rather than of surveillance. It existed. It was kept. It demonstrated compliance with the Act. It did not substantially alter the commercial relationship between chemist and customer. The label requirement, the word poison on bottles containing opium, was applied more consistently than the register requirement, because it was visible and enforceable through inspection of stock. It created, for the first time, a formal acknowledgement on the label itself that the substance had a capacity for harm. Whether this acknowledgement affected purchasing decisions is impossible to determine with precision. What is documented is that the sales of laudanum and related preparations did not decline significantly in the years immediately following the Act. The poison label joined the bottle. The customers continued to come. The limitation of sales to qualified pharmacists was subject to the grandfather registration that allowed all practitioners in trade before the Act's passage to continue without examination. This was politically necessary. Any attempt to immediately require examination of all existing dispensers would have produced sufficient opposition from the trade to endanger the legislation. But it meant that the immediate practical effect of the qualification requirement was minimal. The chemists already in business continued to operate. The customers who had been buying from them continued to buy. The unregistered sellers who operated below the threshold of formal pharmacy, the informal neighbourhood suppliers, the market stall vendors, the grocers who stocked remedies alongside their other goods, were a more contested case, and the prosecution of such sellers was inconsistent and geographically variable. The Pharmaceutical Society, having achieved the regulatory framework it had campaigned for, occupied a position of increasing institutional authority in the trade after 1868. Its journal, the Pharmaceutical Journal, carried the professional conversation about how the Act should be interpreted and applied, and this conversation increasingly included the question of opiate preparations and what, beyond the minimum requirements of the Act, a responsible pharmacist should do about them. Some pharmacists, writing to the journal in the 1870s and 1880s, argued for more proactive restrictions, refusing to sell to known heavy users, asking questions about purpose and dosage, communicating with prescribing physicians about patients who appeared to be consuming preparations beyond therapeutic quantities. Others argued that the pharmacist's role was to dispense what the Act allowed to be dispensed, and that the questions these writers raised were medical questions beyond the professional scope of pharmacy. This professional argument within pharmacy mirrored a parallel argument within medicine. The medical journals of the 1870s and 1880s carried an increasing volume of material on opiate dependency as a clinical condition, not just as an unfortunate side effect of legitimate medical use, but as a condition in its own right, with its own symptomology and requiring its own management. Norman Kerr, the Scottish physician who founded the Society for the Study and Cure of Inebriety in 1884, was a central figure in this shift. Kerr argued consistently that dependency on opiate preparations should be understood as a disease rather than a moral failing, that the appropriate response was medical treatment rather than condemnation, and that the medical profession bore some responsibility for the cases it had produced through the prescribing culture of the preceding decades. The inebriate retreats that had been established since the 1850s to manage alcohol-dependent patients began, in the 1870s and 1880s, to admit opiate-dependent patients in larger numbers. The records of these institutions, where they survive, show a patient population for opiate dependency that was drawn overwhelmingly from the middle classes and was disproportionately female. This was the demographic that the prescribing culture had been producing for decades. The woman who arrived at an inebriate retreat in the 1880s had typically been using laudanum or chlorodyne for 5 to 20 years, had begun with a prescription from her general practitioner, had found that the preparation helped initially, and then that she could not function without it, and had arrived at the retreat not through any voluntary insight, but through the eventual failure of the management strategy that had been applied to her. The long afternoon was also the period in which the international opium question began to intersect more directly with the domestic one. The British imposed opium trade with China, the forced import of Indian opium into the Chinese market, sustained first by the East India Company and after 1858 by the British government, had been a source of humanitarian controversy since the 1830s. The missionary organizations working in China documented the social devastation of mass opium dependency with the same moral language they brought to other colonial abuses, and the reports they produced filtered back to Britain through the religious press and the philanthropic networks. The opium that was destroying Chinese society and the laudanum that was managing English women's nerves came from the same supply chain. The connection was not lost on everyone who looked at both problems, but it was rarely made the centerpiece of either campaign. The reform arguments that were building in the 1870s and 1880s came from multiple directions simultaneously. The temperance movement brought its moral framework about intoxicants. The public health movement brought its empirical documentation of harm. The emerging specialty of addiction medicine brought its argument for disease rather than sin. The women's organizations that would eventually make the gendered dimension of the prescribing culture explicit were beginning to gather their evidence and their language. None of these forces was yet sufficient on its own to produce substantial change in the law or in prescribing culture. But they were gathering, and the afternoon that had been so long and so quiet was beginning very slowly to change its quality. A woman sitting in her parlour in 1875 with her laudanum bottle on the mantelpiece was sitting in a different cultural moment than her mother had occupied in 1845, even if the bottle and the parlour looked much the same. The arguments about what the bottle was doing had changed around her. The legal status of the bottle had changed. The professional discourse about the bottle had changed. She herself might have read something, in a women's magazine or in a friend's letter, that presented the bottle differently than it had been presented to her when she first received her prescription. Or she might not have. The information was less uniformly absent than it had been a generation earlier. It was also not yet uniformly present. The afternoon was still long, the bottle was still there, the city was still going about its business outside. The question of who was actually prescribing laudanum to women in the middle decades of the Victorian period, and in what circumstances, is answered in part by the consultation records that survive from general practice. These are uneven sources. Some practitioners kept meticulous notes, others kept almost none. But they suggest a prescribing culture that was reflexive rather than considered. Laudanum was prescribed because it was what was available, because it was what the previous practitioner had prescribed, because the patient had asked for it by name and the practitioner saw no compelling reason to refuse. The consideration of whether there was a more appropriate treatment was not always a feature of the consultation. The consultation was often brief. The prescription was the outcome. The physical environment of the Victorian consultation room was not designed to facilitate extended inquiry into the social and emotional circumstances of female patients. The physician had a set of time available, a set of patients to see, and a set of tools, the stethoscope, the thermometer, the prescription pad, that were oriented toward the detection and management of physical symptoms. The female patient who presented with what she described as nervous symptoms was presenting something that the physical tools were not designed to investigate in depth, and that the social conventions of the consultation were not designed to explore at length. She described the symptoms. He named them. He wrote the prescription. Both parties returned to their respective situations, which the consultation had not altered. By the 1880s, the general practitioner who had been prescribing laudanum to female patients for 2 decades was beginning to encounter in the medical press an argument that his practice required reconsideration. The argument came from multiple directions simultaneously, from the public health movement, from the emerging specialty of addiction medicine, from the women reformers who were raising the gender dimension of the prescribing culture, from the increasing documentation of inebriate retreat admissions that showed the demographic his prescribing had produced. He did not always engage with this argument, but it was there, accumulating in the journals on his shelf, and it was changing, slowly and unevenly, the cultural context within which the consultation occurred. The prescription was still written. The afternoon was still long, but it was beginning, very slightly, to become something other than permanent. The women who noticed. The campaign to change the place of laudanum in female medical care was not, in the end, built primarily by male physicians or by parliamentarians, though both eventually contributed to it. It was built in the first instance by women who had personal experience of the prescribing culture from the receiving end, women who worked in philanthropic organizations that put them in direct contact with the consequences of that culture in working-class communities, and women who were, by the 1880s and 1890s, beginning to enter the medical profession in small but increasing numbers, and who brought to their clinical practice different assumptions about what female patients needed and what they could reasonably be told. The British Women's Temperance Association, founded in 1876, drew its membership primarily from nonconformist Protestant communities, Quakers, Methodists, Congregationalists, where the moral argument against intoxicants had roots going back to the previous century. The organization's founding focus was alcohol, the domestic violence associated with male drinking, the poverty produced by wages spent in public houses, the physical deterioration of working-class families in industrial towns where cheap gin and beer were more available than clean water had recently been. These were real and well-documented problems, and the women of the BWTA had the evidence to support their arguments. But many of the most active members of the organization had noticed in the course of their philanthropic work in working-class districts that the households they visited had a second intoxicant problem that received far less public attention. The laudanum in the medicine cabinet, the Godfrey's cordial given to infants, the older women in the neighbourhood whose hands shook when they were delayed in obtaining their drops. These were observations made in the course of work that was primarily about something else, and they accumulated in the letters and journals of the women who made them without quite finding an organisational home. The BWTA would eventually address opium as well as alcohol, but it did so slowly because the opium question implicated middle-class medical practice in ways that the alcohol question did not, and that made it more socially complicated to address. The secondness of the laudanum problem, its cultural invisibility relative to the more publicly legible alcohol question, was in part a matter of social geography. Alcohol's most visible harms were public and often spectacular. Brawls outside public houses, men insensible on pavements, the well-documented epidemiology of liver disease, and industrial accidents associated with heavy drinking. Laudanum's harms were private and quiet. The woman who took her drops in the back bedroom of a respectable house, who managed her day around the timing of her doses, who was somewhat quieter than she had been 10 years ago, and somewhat less engaged with the world outside her household. This was not a public spectacle. It was a domestic condition, visible only to those who lived inside the household or had reason to visit it regularly. Elizabeth Malleson was one of the reformers who went looking for what the domestic conditions contained. A social reformer and educationist who had been active in the working-class education movement in London since the 1860s, she published in 1884 a pamphlet called The Opium Question at Home that addressed the domestic laudanum question with a directness unusual for published material of the period. Malleson argued that the medical profession's practice of prescribing laudanum to female patients as a treatment for nervous complaints was producing a population of dependent women whose dependency was then attributed to their inherent constitutional weakness, rather than to the prescription they had received, The physician prescribed the preparation. The patient developed a dependency. The dependency produced symptoms, the restlessness, the insomnia, the distress when the dose was delayed, that were attributed to the original nervous condition rather than to the pharmaceutical management of it. The prescription was renewed. The cycle continued. Malson's pamphlet was not widely reviewed in the medical press, which was the press that would have needed to engage with her argument to produce clinical change. But it circulated in the reform networks, the temperance organisations, the women's suffrage societies, the charitable associations that worked in working-class districts, and it contributed to a growing body of lay opinion that the medical profession's prescribing culture deserved scrutiny from outside as well as from within. The scrutiny from within was slower and more ambivalent. The medical profession had invested substantial authority in the diagnostic framework that produced laudanum prescriptions for nervous female patients, and the frameworks of professional organisations do not dissolve quickly in response to external criticism. But there were physicians who were reconsidering the prescribing culture from within, and their voices were becoming more prominent in the medical journals of the 1880s. Norman Kerr, whose Society for the Study and Cure of Inebriety brought the disease framework to addiction medicine, was the most prominent of these. John Harley, whose 1869 treatise on opium had addressed the dependency question more carefully than most contemporary texts, was another. A handful of medical officers of health in the manufacturing districts had been raising the infant opiate question in professional publications for a decade and a half. What these physicians shared was a willingness to follow the clinical evidence into territory that was uncomfortable for the medical establishment, the territory that acknowledged that medical practice had contributed to the problem rather than simply responding to it. The prescribing culture that had sustained laudanum's place in female medicine had been built by physicians and maintained by physicians and reviewed by physicians who supervised the education of the next generation. Acknowledging that this culture had produced harm required acknowledging something that professional organisations generally resisted acknowledging, that the standard of care had been, in significant ways, inadequate. The women who were entering the medical profession in the 1880s and 1890s did so under conditions that were still considerably more resistant than those their male contemporaries faced. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who had qualified as a physician in 1865 after a protracted legal and institutional struggle that required her to sit examinations through the Society of Apothecaries when all other examining boards refused her, had established by the 1880s a practice and an institution, the New Hospital for Women opened in 1872, that offered female patients medical care staffed entirely by women practitioners. The new hospital's admissions records and published reports describe an approach to female patients that differed from the mainstream in its willingness to investigate the specific causes of symptoms rather than attributing them to constitutional weakness, and in its more cautious approach to pharmaceutical management. Sophia Jex-Blake, who had fought her own prolonged battle for admission to the Edinburgh Medical School in the early 1870s, and who eventually qualified in Ireland before being admitted to the British Medical Register, wrote and lectured on the prescribing culture and its effects on female patients, with a directness that her position outside the mainstream medical establishment allowed. Her published writing on the subject noted that the woman who arrived at a physician's consulting room with symptoms of nervous distress and left with a laudanum prescription had been given a management tool that addressed the subjective experience of her symptoms without providing any information about their cause, any investigation of what might have produced them, or any guidance about what might change if something in her circumstances or her body were different. The women's suffrage movement, which was building its political infrastructure and its argument through the 1880s and 1890s, brought to the laudanum question a political analysis that the medical reform literature did not always make explicit. If women's symptoms were being managed rather than addressed because women's suffering was considered a natural condition rather than a remediable one, if the prescribing culture reflected an assumption that the woman's pain was less worth investigating than a man's pain because women were constitutionally prone to it, then the prescribing culture was a medical expression of a political fact. The political fact was that women's lives were considered less subject to rational improvement than men's lives. The medical expression of that fact was the prescription that quieted the patient, rather than the investigation that might have altered her circumstances. Annie Besant made this argument in 1897 in her essay on the drugging of women, and it attracted the attention and criticism that any argument of sufficient clarity tends to attract. The criticism focused on her attribution of motive, on the charge that she was implying physicians were deliberately suppressing female patients, which she had not quite said. What she had said was that the effect of a practice matters regardless of the intention behind it, and that the effect of 2 centuries of laudanum prescriptions to women presenting with nervous complaint had been, structurally, the pharmaceutical management of women who might otherwise have been more difficult for the surrounding world to manage. The criticism of her attribution was fair in its narrow sense. It did not engage with the structural argument. The structural argument would take decades more to settle, and settling it would require legislative changes, the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920, the development of prescription-only categories, the eventual restriction of opiate preparations to medical oversight, combined with cultural changes that shifted the understanding of what dependency was, who it affected, and what the appropriate response to it might be. These changes came. They were slower than the evidence warranted. The women who had been quieted while the debate continued did not benefit from the changes that came after them. But the changes came, and they rested on the foundation of evidence and argument that the women who noticed, in factory districts and reform organisations and medical schools and parliamentary testimony, had spent decades assembling. The bottle on the mantelpiece had been there since before anyone living could remember. Removing it from the centre of female medical care required more than a single argument, more than a single piece of legislation, more than a single generation of reformers. It required the accumulation of evidence, in case notes and death registers and parliamentary reports and medical journal articles and reform pamphlets, sufficient to make the cost visible to enough people with enough power to act on what they saw. That accumulation was the work of people who noticed what was happening in the houses and consulting rooms and chemists' shops of Victorian England, and who decided that noticing was not sufficient, and that saying something loudly and with specificity might eventually produce change. The legislative changes that eventually altered the commercial and medical landscape of laudanum prescribing came slowly, but they came with a consistency that reflected the accumulation of evidence and argument that the women who noticed had assembled over decades. The Pharmacy Act Amendment Act of 1908 tightened the registration requirements established in 1868, required more specific labelling, and introduced restrictions on the sale of certain opiate preparations that had previously been available without limitation. The Hague Convention of 1912, which Britain signed, established for the first time an international framework for the control of narcotic drugs and committed signatory nations to restricting opiate production and trade to medical purposes. The Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 brought British domestic law into alignment with the Hague framework and required a medical prescription for opiate preparations, the change that moved laudanum definitively from the open shelf to the controlled prescription. These legislative changes were the outcome that the accumulated evidence and argument had been working toward across decades. They came after more women had been dependent than needed to have been, after more infants had been dosed than the medical knowledge of the 1840s had made avoidable, after more consultations had produced prescriptions rather than investigations than any of the reformers would have considered acceptable. The changes came. They were belated. Both things are true and both things are part of what the records remember. What the records remember. The Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 did not end the use of opiate preparations in British medicine. It changed the conditions of that use, moved it from the open shelf to the prescription pad, from the chemist's commercial discretion to the physician's clinical authority, from a transaction that required no documentation to one that required a signed prescription from a registered practitioner. The substance remained, the need remained. The relationship between women and opiate prescriptions, which had been established over 2 centuries of medical culture, did not dissolve with a change in the law. It adapted. What changed over the long course of the 19th and early 20th centuries was the visibility of the relationship. The woman who had taken laudanum discreetly from a brown bottle in 1860 was replaced, in the legal and medical record, by a more documented patient, one whose prescriptions were recorded, whose doses were notionally managed by a professional with formal qualifications, whose dependency, when it developed, was more likely to be identified by an institutional system designed to identify it. The change was real, and it was significant. It was also partial, and the partiality is worth acknowledging rather than eliding. The pattern that laudanum had established, the pharmaceutical management of female distress, the preference for chemical quieting over structural change, the assumption that a woman's pain could be adequately addressed by altering her subjective experience of it rather than by altering the conditions that produced it, did not end with laudanum itself. It persisted, adapted to new molecules. The barbiturates that came into wide use in the 1920s and 1930s followed a trajectory that was, in retrospect, strikingly familiar. Marketed initially as safe and non-habit forming, prescribed extensively to female patients presenting with nervous symptoms, gradually recognized as producing dependency in long-term users, eventually restricted after the accumulation of evidence became undeniable. The regulatory lag between recognition and action was decades. The patients who used barbiturates during those decades bore the cost of the lag. The benzodiazepines, Valium and Librium, and the minor tranquilizers that became the most prescribed drugs in the world by the 1970s repeated the same pattern with a precision that should have been predictable. Valium, introduced in 1963, was marketed as safer than the barbiturates it replaced. It was prescribed at a rate that made it, within a decade, the most dispensed pharmaceutical in Britain and the United States. Its primary recipients were women presenting with anxiety and nervous symptoms. By the mid-1970s, evidence of benzodiazepine dependency was accumulating in the medical press. By the 1980s, the problem was visible enough to generate parliamentary inquiry in Britain and significant litigation in the United States. Researchers working in that period noted explicitly that the history of barbiturate overprescription to women should have provided a warning that had not been heeded. Each repetition of the pattern suggests something more durable than any individual drug or any individual generation of prescribers. It suggests a structural tendency in the relationship between a medical system and its female patients, in the commercial incentive structure of pharmaceutical development, in the cultural assumption that female nervous distress is a condition of biology rather than a response to circumstances, that persists across the specific substances through which it expresses itself. The laudanum in the 1860 cabinet and the Valium in the 1970 cabinet are different molecules doing different things to different receptors in different nervous systems. The social function they served was not entirely different. The women whose names appear in the historical record of laudanum, Elizabeth Barrett and Florence Nightingale and Elizabeth Siddal, and the Cornish farmer's daughter, and the woman who described herself as a prisoner to her Birmingham physician, represent a fraction of the population whose experience the record was not designed to capture. The majority of Victorian women who took laudanum left no documents that historians have found. Their names are not in biographies. Their letters were not preserved by literary estates. Their physicians' casebooks were lost or discarded. Their relationship with the bottle was entirely ordinary, which is to say entirely invisible to the standard instruments of historical inquiry. The ordinariness is perhaps the most historically significant thing about laudanum's place in Victorian female life. It was not an exceptional feature of the world these women inhabited. It was a background condition, as common as headache, as unremarkable as the coal fire, as ordinary as the weekly purchase from the chemist who knew your name. It was present in the medicine cabinet of women who were otherwise fully and complexly engaged with their worlds, managing households, raising children, corresponding with friends across distances, thinking their own thoughts about things the record sometimes captures and sometimes does not. The bottle did not define these women. It was simply there, doing what it did, within the larger context of lives that had many dimensions the bottle had nothing to do with. What the historical record does allow is a view of the system within which the bottle appeared and persisted. The system involved physicians who believed sincerely that female nervous complaint was a genuine and common condition requiring pharmaceutical management. It involved a commercial infrastructure, wholesale druggists, retail chemists, patent medicine manufacturers, advertisers, that profited from consistent and growing demand. It involved a legal and regulatory framework that treated opium as an ordinary commodity until the evidence of harm became impossible to ignore and the professional interests of pharmacy aligned with the public health interest in restriction. And it involved a cultural framework constructed across medicine and literature and domestic advice and religious teaching that told women their bodies were unreliable, their emotions excessive, their pain better managed than investigated, their relief better achieved through a dose than through a change in the conditions that had produced the pain. The bottle on the mantelpiece was the product of all of these things simultaneously. To understand laudanum's history is to understand that no single element of the system provides a sufficient explanation. The greedy commercial interest and the careless prescription, and the complicit culture and the inadequate regulation are all necessary parts of the story, and none of them is complete on its own. The woman who paid for her drops and walked home with them in her basket was making a rational decision within a system that the balance of evidence suggests was irrational in important ways. The rationality of her decision, and the irrationality of the system that produced her need, coexisted without contradiction. They coexist in the historical record, in the same archives, in the same boxes of documents, on the same shelves. The records remember, in their silences as much as in their inscriptions, a world in which the management of women's pain was a significant industry, a medical institution, and a daily unremarkable fact. They remember it not as a scandal requiring the assignment of blame. It was too ordinary to be scandalous, and too distributed in its causes to be easily blamed on any individual, but as a condition, the condition of living in a body that the surrounding world considered constitutionally unreliable in a time when pharmaceutical quieting was immediately available, affordably priced, and widely endorsed by the professional authorities to whom one was expected to defer. The records hold this without editorializing. They hold what was there. The rest is what we bring to the reading of them. The November evening in 1862 has grown dark. The coal fire in the parlour has burned down to a low steady glow. The orange at the centre of each coal, the occasional small collapse of ash, the warmth that radiates without noise. The woman who stood at the chemist's counter this morning is sitting now in the chair by the window, the curtains drawn against the street, the room enclosed and warm. The brown bottle is on the mantelpiece. She has taken her drops. The grief that has been with her since January is still there somewhere. It does not go anywhere exactly. It simply recedes, like a tide going out slowly across a long flat shore, leaving the surface quieter than it was before. The chair, the fire, the faint sound of the street outside, horses and a distant voice and then nothing, and then a door somewhere closing softly. The city is settling into its evening. A lamp goes on in the house across the street, visible for a moment through the curtains before she closes them fully. The small sounds of the world continuing. Water moving somewhere in the walls, the creak of a floorboard above, the last of the coal settling in the grate. She's not asleep. She's somewhere near the edge of it, that particular half-country where the thoughts slow down and become less urgent, where the day loses its hold and the body begins to make its own arrangements for the night. The chair is comfortable. The warmth from the fire arrives in slow, steady waves. The room smells of coal and of the wool of her dress, and, faintly, of the anise from the bottle on the mantelpiece. Let the fire continue its slow work. Let the room become a little quieter with each minute. Let the chair hold you where you are, and the warmth be enough, and the sounds of the house settle into the particular silence that follows a long day in an ordinary year. The street outside has gone quiet. The lamp in the upstairs window of the house across the street has been extinguished. Somewhere, a clock is measuring time in its slow, patient way. Not urgently, not calling attention to itself, simply marking the passage of one moment into the next, without requiring anything from the person who hears it. The year 1862 recedes, the brown bottle recedes. The chemist's shop with its smell of licorice and cloves and warm stone recedes into the particular darkness of a November evening 2 centuries ago, and the quiet that was there in that parlour is hit now in whatever room you are in whatever city at whatever hour this is for you. The fire was low, the curtains were drawn, the November air was outside doing what November air does. The rest was sleep. If you enjoyed this story, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if there's a substance or chapter of history you'd like me to cover next, leave it in the comments below. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well.